Our VPage and VCom products ship with the latest firmware, but depending upon when you're installing the hardware, you might need to eventually update firmware. Or, if you're swapping out a unit in an existing installation, you might need to downgrade your firmware to match what all the other units in the attraction are running. This video will go over how to update and downgrade firmware, as well as a few troubleshooting tips in case the firmware update does not go as planned. We'll be using a VPage unit in our example, but if you're upgrading a VCom instead, the same principles apply. VPVC utilities. The recommended way to update firmware on a VPage or VCom unit is with our VPage plus VCom utilities program, also known as VPVC utilities. This is a free piece of software available for download on our website at alcorn.com/support/software. As of this recording, the latest version of the software is version 1.04. Currently, this is a Windows-only program. Sorry, Mac users. Once downloaded, let's get this running. VPVC Utilities is an executable program. It's standalone software, so no folders or directories will be added to your PC. You just have to run it every time you'd like to use it. Finding your unit. Once VPVC Utilities is open and you wait a few seconds, the program will scan your network and find all of your VPage or VCom units you are connected to. If you're not seeing anything, make sure that you have the correct NIC of the computer selected from the drop-down menu in the upper left-hand corner. Your units should then appear in this list. Here you can see that I only have one VPage VP4X on my network. It shows the unit's current IP address as well as what the unit's current firmware is. If you're still not seeing anything listed, perhaps your network might be configured to block broadcast packets. You want to make sure that the NIC you have specified can broadcast data to the VPages on your network. If not, you won't be able to use VPVC utilities. If you're connected to lots of VPage units and have lost track of which hardware is which, if you check the Identify on Click box, then select from the list what VPage or VCom you want to find, it will make the buttons on the unit flash green momentarily. The information of the unit you have selected appears on the main display here. You can see what the LEDs are up to, when any button inputs are pressed, and a lot of Dante and control information. Not only is VPVC Utilities helpful in updating firmware, but it's good for overall troubleshooting in case your VPage or VCom gets set to an IP address you can't remember or other things like that. Updating firmware. Now let's get to updating the firmware. The VPage I am connected to is new out of the box. The state it is currently in can also be achieved by flipping dip switch number 2 on and then off again while powered up to get the unit back to factory default settings. Out of the box, or again after you have reset to factory defaults, when first plugged into a network, your VPage unit will look for a DHCP server. If one is set up, it will automatically be assigned an IP address in the range that your DHCP server is setting devices to. If you do not have a DHCP server set up, which is my case, the VPage will automatically be assigned a random control IP address in the 169.254.xxx.xxx range. This is fine if you don't need to update firmware and are automatically linking a unit in QSys Designer. But if you need to first update firmware, we must set the control IP address to something different. You'll see if I go to Admin, the Enter Firmware Update box is grayed out. This is because the 169.254.xxx.xxx IP range is special in that it is a private address. The unicast packets needed to be sent for firmware update will not work while the VPage is in this range. Again, this won't be an issue if you're working with a VPage or VCom unit that already has a different IP address assigned to it. But since that is not our case here, we must get this resolved. To move the control IP out of the 169.254 range, VPVC Utilities has a built-in bootp tool we can use. Simply click the Enable bootp Discovery checkbox. Then select the unit we want to change the control IP address of. You will now be able to enter and assign an IP address of your choice. Since my computer is set up on the 192.168.0 subnet, I'm going to assign my VPage unit an IP address of 192.168.0.69. Click the Assign IP button. You'll then notice that the VP4X switches the IP address in the list, and the old address will eventually drop off. Now we're in action. Now we can go to Admin, Enter Firmware Update. Once Enter Firmware Update has been clicked, two things will happen. First, you'll see the VPage start to rapidly flash its light screen. This means that the VPage unit is in Firmware Update mode. Second, a tab will automatically open in your default web browser at the IP address of your VCom or VPage unit. If for some reason a tab doesn't automatically open, simply open your favorite browser and enter your VPage or VCom's IP address. From here, you can update the firmware. Click Choose File and find the os.new file for the firmware you'd like to upgrade or downgrade to. All of our VPage and VCom firmware can be downloaded from the Alcorn McBride website. Once the file has been selected, click Update Firmware. It will take a minute or two, but then your firmware should be updated. If for whatever reason the firmware update fails, try selecting your os.new file and clicking Update Firmware once more. Once the firmware update is complete, your VPage should slowly start flashing red like it's looking for a QSys core. I like to find the unit again in VPVC Utilities just to confirm the firmware update has taken place. In our case, we can see I updated from 2.14 to 2.15.01. If I don't want the unit to stay at the temporary IP address I assigned it with the boot P settings, you can again reset your unit back to factory defaults by flipping on then off dip switch number 2 while the unit is powered up. Or you can press the Reset to Defaults button in VPVC Utilities. Your VPage will lose all of its IP settings and will revert back to that random 169.254 number, but it will still be at the firmware that you just updated to. If the VPage or VCom is already at your intended IP address, there's no need to revert back to factory defaults. Firmware Recovery Mode. What happens in the off chance that a firmware update fails? A backup plan is to force your VPage or VCom unit into Firmware Recovery Mode. Firmware Recovery Mode is only recommended to be performed on test bench connected to your computer, not while connected to your Traction's main network. To enter Firmware Recovery Mode, first make sure that your VPage or VCom is powered off. Flip dip switch number 2 to the on position, then power up the unit. When powered up, you'll notice two things. First, your VPage will be forced into Firmware Update mode. You'll see the button LEDs will be rapidly flashing green. Second, this also forces the VPage or VCom to temporarily park at the specific address of 192.168.0.254. Because of this, you can only perform Firmware Recovery Mode on one unit at a time. Once you see the green flashing LEDs, open up a tab in your favorite web browser and navigate to 192.168.0.254. Then you'll be able to attempt a firmware update again. Before you do, flip dip switch number 2 back to the off position. This is important to remember. If you update the firmware before doing this, your VPage will reboot eternally in firmware update mode, and you'll be stuck in a never-ending loop of re-entering firmware update mode. When the VPage comes back online, it will no longer be at 192.168.0.254, but instead at the last remembered control IP address. If you don't know what that was, feel free to flip dip switch number 2 on then off again while powered up to reset the unit to factory defaults. Then you should be good to go.